Well, guys, I have done my rankings for both the AFL and the NRL. And today I did just want to take a look at the arenas in the NBL and also a few other arenas in Australia that are significant and rank them from the worst all the way to the best. And let's get right into it with number 14. It is the Silver Dome in Launceston, Tasmania. This is one of the home grounds of the Tasmania Jack Jumpers. They do play a couple of games a year here in the NBL. It was built all the way back in 1984. It is a former velodrome for cycling. Currently, the capacity for basketball is around 3.2k or around 5,000 when not in the basketball configuration. And you do have a really brutal exterior, really ugly looking 80s style design. In terms of the interior, it does sort of look like a high school gym. You do have the exposed girders on the roof and just that tin look and the cold, damp look that you do get with a lot of the venues that were built in around the 1980s. At number 13, we do have the State Basketball Centre in Melbourne. It is home of the Southeast Melbourne Phoenix, built in 2011. It is small, only a capacity of around 3,200. It is quite modern compared to the other ones, but obviously built very cheaply. It's not really intended to be an NBL standard arena. You do have the built-up sides, but then behind one of the goals you do see it is just a wall. I really don't like that look. It does look really cheap. And this arena really just a suburban sort of local basketball centre. It isn't really designed for a professional team. And I have got it in at number 13 on my list. At number 12, I do have the Townsville Entertainment Centre in North Queensland. This was built back in 1993. It does seat around 5.2k and it was the former home ground of the NBL team, the Townsville Crocodiles, who obviously no longer exist. They did go broke in around 2016, 2017. And this was where they played their games. Obviously, it is a very standard style arena. You do basically have a 2-deck approach. It's not a bad stadium, but you do have the low roof. I really don't like that. It does feel quite cramped. And it is just a typical 90s style arena. Look at the exterior. It does sort of look like a museum or something like that, where you do have the white sort of walls and the low roof. Very generic looking 90s design. At number 11, I do have my State Bank Arena in Hobart in Tasmania. Of course, this is the main home stadium of the Jack Jumpers, the new NBL franchise. This stadium was built back in 1989 and it was renovated in 2021 for the introduction of the Jack Jumpers into the NBL. It does seat around 4.3k. They have actually sold out most of their games, so it does definitely sell. Maybe you could make the argument maybe they do need a new arena in Hobart. In terms of the interior, you do have basically a 3-quarter design where the seating wraps around, but then on the wing, you just have that low area where they put the corporate boxes, the open air corporate boxes where you do have the commentators, and just a cheap looking design there. Really, the better arenas, you will have a wraparound seating, and there is a lot of symmetry to where you can't really tell where the broadcast side was, but obviously in this case, it was retrofitted to be a professional arena, and really it has just been a suburban arena for the majority of its life. In the exterior, you can see the facade that they did install for the renovation near the gate there. It does look quite nice. It does just freshen it up a bit. And then when you see the wide shots of what the arena used to look like, it is just brutal. And again, that typical late 80s, early 90s design where they didn't put a lot of emphasis on the aesthetics of it, and it just looked pretty cheap and ugly. At number 10, I have got the Cairns Convention Centre, the home of the Cairns Taipans. This arena was built back in 1996. It did get a renovation in 2011, and they did also give it a recent exterior expansion and renovation a couple of years ago. You can see from the exterior, you do have that sort of multicoloured facade there with the entrance gates up against the road, and you see the sort of ribbed design of the roof as well. That is an original design element of the arena, but it does sort of remind me of a snake, obviously with the taipans. In terms of the interior, the roof actually looks really nice, where you can see it is a high roof. You do have that sort of up and down zigzag style design. It is unique, but it does look pretty good in this instance. It does seat around 5,300. You do have the upper deck wrapping all the way around and a nice amount of symmetry inside the stadium. And you can just see with the high roof, it makes a lot of difference. It doesn't feel as cheap and cramped as, say, the Townsville Entertainment Centre. At number 9, we have got the Wollongong Entertainment Centre, home of the Illawarra Hawks. This was built back in 1998. It does seat around 6,000. If you look at the exterior, it is quite simple, but I do like how it intertwines with the sort of urban fabric of the city. It is right next to the NRL stadium in Wollongong, where the St George Illawarra Dragons do play a few games a year. And the difference between arenas and stadiums, you really want arenas to be in a city. You really don't want them taking up a big footprint. So I really like when they're tied up against roads, and it does really fit with the urban fabric and sort of the design elements of the city itself. Obviously with stadiums, you do want large footprints where people can congregate. Typically stadiums, you are going to have bigger capacities obviously as well, so you do need more room. But with arenas, the best ones will be in a city and they will fit in, and it won't necessarily be so obvious what you're looking at when you drive past. Maybe you know it's a sporting arena, but you might not think it holds 5, 10, 15,000. They do disguise it quite well, and that is what you see with a lot of the big time arenas in the US. In terms of the interior, it is pretty simple, but again, it does remind me of sort of a mini NBA arena. You do have the upper deck going all the way around. It does fill in the corners. And then obviously you have the movable lower sections. When you do have a concert, you can take them out. Very typical Australian arena, but it is quite nice and it does look pretty clean on the inside. At number 8, I do have the Gold Coast Entertainment Centre, built in 2004. This was the former home arena of the Gold Coast Blaze, which were an NBL team that lasted around 3 or 4 seasons. They did go broke in the early 2010s. In terms of this stadium, it is pretty generic from the inside. You do have a pretty low roof. You do just have 2 decks of seating, and it does wrap around on the corners. The exterior though is quite interesting. You do have a lot of walkways going across over the river. It is a fairly grand looking design, even though it does only hold 6,000 people. Obviously that white does look a bit dated, and it is a bit confused in terms of what it is. You do have different parts of the roof and walls going out at different angles, and you can tell with this arena it does have a very big footprint for what it is, and you don't have a lot of building density around it. But in terms of the exterior, I do have this slightly above some of the other arenas that have come earlier in the list. They are planning on building a new arena on the Gold Coast for the 2032 Brisbane Olympics. That arena will be built at Southport. I did make a video on this around a month ago. It does look very nice, and obviously when that does get built, you would expect the Gold Coast will get an NBL team again, and that arena will be appearing a lot higher on this list. At number 7, I do have another arena in southeast Queensland, the Brisbane Entertainment Centre. It does seat around 13,000. It was built way back in 1986. Of course, it is the home ground of the Brisbane Bullets in the NBL, and this one is absolutely brutal from the exterior. It is horrendously ugly. It does remind me of a hospital, and very typical 80s, late 80s design, just really ugly. And this thing, in all honesty, needs a wrecking ball. I do have it so high on the list because it does have a pretty decent capacity, around 13k. The interior is slightly better than the exterior, but again, the seating pattern is really ugly. You do have a pretty low roof, and it's just a really average arena. Of course, with Brisbane getting the Olympics in 2032, they are planning on building a new arena called Brisbane Live. It will be located right in a city. It is estimated to cost over $2 billion, and it does look really nice, and I would expect that arena to probably be number 1 on this list in the future. And certainly the city of Brisbane certainly needs a new arena. I'm sure the Brisbane Bullets will be happy about that, because this Brisbane Entertainment Centre is just really poor. At number 6, I do have the Adelaide Entertainment Centre. Again, a very similar arena to a lot of the other ones on this list. It does seat around 11,300, built back in 1991. It did get a renovation in 2010, and it is of course home to the Adelaide 36ers in the NBL. In terms of the interior, very generic 2-deck design. I do like the red seating colour, which does match the 36ers and South Australia. The roof again is quite low. It does feel a bit claustrophobic. It does have that boxy sort of design, very square angles. The corners are filled in, which is a positive, but very generic arena from the inside. And when you look at the outside, they did put this curved roof sort of gate where they do light it up in multicoloured different designs and colours. That was part of the renovation. And it's a little hard to see, but you can see the arena here in the background. And this is very similar to the one in Brisbane, just an extremely ugly concrete and white late 80s, early 90s design. And certainly you can see when it is next to the car park, which is newer. When the car park looks better than the arena, you know it is a pretty ugly arena. And they have done a good job of trying to hide it with that renovation and also building the car park on the side. But again, a very generic, boring arena in Adelaide. At number 5, I do have the Spark Arena in Auckland, New Zealand. Obviously, this is not in Australia, but I did want to include it because the New Zealand Breakers do play in the NBL. And I actually quite like the exterior of this thing. It was built back in 2007. It does seat around 12K. And it does sort of remind me of a mini NBA style arena, especially the exterior. You do have a sort of more modern design. It does fit in well. It is bunched up against the street there. You do have that small area for it to congregate, but it really fits the urban fabric of the area. And it just makes a big difference. All these arenas look a lot better when they're not surrounded by big open parklands or a big car park or something like that. It just fits in nicely with the streetscape, and it is pretty nice, especially from the outside. You do have the windows and a sort of unique design. The interior, though, very, very average, very generic. It is basically a 2-deck design, but they have made it so you can walk between the upper and lower decks. And obviously you do have the corporate facilities between the 2 decks. And again, the roof just looks pretty exposed and pretty ordinary in this one. You do see a bit more of a curved design in the corners. It does look a bit more modern, obviously, as you would expect. It is only around 17 years old, so that does put it above sort of Brisbane and Adelaide, but definitely the exterior on this one better than the interior. At number 4, you do have John Cain Arena, home of Melbourne United. It is also the secondary court in the Australian Open tennis. First arena on the list, it does have a retractable roof. This thing built back in 2000. It does seat around 10K people. And obviously it was built for the Australian Open tennis, but the Melbourne United team have really adopted playing there. It is certainly unique to a degree having a retractable roof on an arena, but obviously with tennis, it is a primarily outdoor sport. You do want the wind and the sun to get in for tennis. Obviously it is rarely to never open for basketball, but it does work pretty well for tennis. I would say it's probably a better tennis arena than a basketball arena. And you can see here, it's really obvious with the corners. The seating doesn't wrap all the way around, and it does just make it look a bit cheap, especially for basketball and netball and those sort of things. And the exterior is actually pretty decent on this. I do like the roof. It does fit the Melbourne Park design language, where you do have those exposed roof structures. You do have the white and blue theme, which is pretty common in Melbourne Park. And all in all, this arena is pretty good. You do have a nice capacity. Maybe if there was a way to fill in the corners, it might be a little bit higher on the list. At number 3, I do have Rod Laver Arena, of course, the main stadium for the Australian Open. I had to put this on there. Obviously, it's not a NBL arena, but it probably is the most famous Australian arena, given that it does host the final of a major Grand Slam tennis tournament. It does seat around 14,800, so it does have a pretty nice capacity. Again, you do have a retractable roof. This thing actually was built way back in 1988, and it has got sort of a couple of renovations in its time. You can tell it is a bit dated, a very dated seating bowl. You do also have the exposed staircases going up to the upper deck, really not something you see in a lot of modern stadiums and arenas. They did swap out the seats a few years ago. It does look a bit nicer, but still it does show its age, no doubt. In terms of the exterior, the original part of the arena is pretty average, but they did put those big convention center style open areas over the gates, and you do get some amenities for fans in that. It does look a little bit weird when you contrast it to the original arena, but certainly modernizes it, especially from the ground level. And the Melbourne Olympic Park area and the location where they do have the Australian Open tennis, no doubt that is a very good design element of Melbourne, where they do keep them all in the same area. So I am kind of going away from my criteria where it is generally in a city and tied into the urban fabric. But I think when you are hosting a Grand Slam tennis event, you do want that contained in its own sort of area. So it does get a tick in that respect. At number 2, I do have Kudos Bank Arena in Sydney, the largest arena in Australia. It does seat around 18,000. This thing was built back in 1999 for the 2000 Sydney Olympics. It is the home ground of the Sydney Kings in the NBL. It is located in the Sydney Olympic Park complex in Homebush. And when you look at the interior, this thing is a behemoth. You do have the 3 seating bowls with the corporate seating between the second and third levels. I would like to see that maybe being just 1 or 2 bowls, not 3, but it was built over 25 years ago at this point. You do have the exposed underside of the roof where it does look a bit cheap. Maybe you wouldn't see that in modern arenas as much, but really this thing does look nice. It does have an industrial sort of feel to it. You do have all 3 levels of the seating wrapping around the whole arena. It is curved, it doesn't feel boxy. You do have the high ceiling, it doesn't feel cramped, but certainly this would be on par with some of the NBA arenas in America, probably a bottom 4 or 5 arena in America, but still for Australia this is very good. Sydney Kings do generally get pretty good crowds, and this does also host a bunch of concerts and things like that. In terms of the exterior though, definitely not as good. It does show its age here. It doesn't feel very grand because a lot of it is below ground level, and you do have that big exposed paving area around, and it is also not located in the CBD. It is located in the Olympic Park area of Sydney, which obviously you would expect it to be given it was built for the Olympics, but if this was around the CBD, I probably might consider having it a little bit higher. But all in all, still a very good arena by Australian standards. And at number 1, it's probably no great surprise, I have got RAC Arena in Perth, home of the Wildcats, the most famous and historically successful NBL team. This arena also is pretty new. It was only built back in 2012. It does have a nice capacity, 15,500. You do also have the retractable roof, so it is really the only retractable roof arena in Australia that's not part of the Australian Open tennis. And of course they do play tennis here. It did host the Hopman Cup when that still existed, and now they do host some other pre-Australian Open tennis tournament in Perth. But this arena definitely does tick all the boxes. It is located in the CBD. The exterior, some people don't like the design. It is very abstract. You do have the geometric patterns sort of going everywhere. You do have the blue and white / silver design, but it's definitely grown on most people since it was built, and surprisingly it doesn't look tacky and ridiculous, which sometimes when they do these extravagant designs they do look a bit cheap, but they definitely did a good job with this one. It is a small footprint. You can see it is built right up against the roads on either side. It doesn't take up a lot of room, but the best part of this is definitely the interior. You do have the blue very prominent. You do have the high ceiling. You do have basically just one big deck of seating all the way around the ground. It is a very modern design. Everyone feels like they're right on top of the action. You do have the retractable roof. You do have the movable seating for basketball and also concerts. And really this, no doubt, is the best arena in Australia and the best arena, of course, in the NBL. That is all we're going to have time for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.